Why can't you just accept things the way everyone else does? Why does a simple answer never feel like enough? Why do you find yourself turning over a statement someone made hours ago, checking it for cracks, wondering what they left out? If you've ever been called too much for asking one more question, or watched a room go quiet because you wouldn't just nod along, there's a reason for that. And it's not a character flaw. It's a pattern your mind built on purpose a long time ago, and it's still running in the background of almost everything you do. There's a name for what's happening underneath all of this, and once you hear it, you'll probably recognize yourself immediately. Psychologists call it epistemic vigilance. It's your mind's built-in alarm system for detecting when something doesn't add up, when a story has a hole in it, when a person's words don't match their actions. It's not about being negative. It's about your brain treating unverified information the way your immune system treats an unfamiliar virus, as something to test before it's allowed in. And here's the part that matters most. This alarm system doesn't turn on randomly. It gets switched to high sensitivity by experience. Somewhere along the way, you learned that taking things at face value cost you something. Maybe it cost you trust. Maybe it cost you safety. Maybe it just cost you the humiliation of being wrong in front of people who weren't being honest with you. So your mind made a decision, never again without checking first. And you might be doing this right now in ways so automatic you don't even notice them anymore. Reading between the lines of a text message, replaying a conversation to catch the part that felt slightly off, asking "but why" 3 times in a row until you get to something real. This pattern doesn't show up the same way in every person, though. It has faces. Different versions of it appear depending on what shaped a person's mind. And once you can name which version you're looking at, in yourself or in someone close to you, the whole picture gets a lot less confusing. So in this video, we're going to walk through 7 distinct psychological patterns behind people who question everything, what's actually happening inside their minds when they do it, and where each pattern came from. Some of these will feel uncomfortably familiar. Stay until the end because the last one is the part most people miss entirely, the part that explains why constant questioning can quietly become its own kind of prison. Let's start with the version of this that looks the most like simple curiosity on the surface, because it's the one most people misread. The first pattern is what we'll call the pattern seeker. This is the part of the mind that can't let an inconsistency sit unresolved. Cognitive psychologists describe this as a low tolerance for what's called cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding 2 pieces of information that contradict each other. Most people can shrug off a contradiction and move on with their day. The pattern-seeking mind can't. It itches, it nags, it pulls focus away from everything else until the inconsistency gets resolved, one way or another. Picture someone in a meeting where a manager says the company values transparency, then watches that same manager quietly leave a colleague out of an email chain that clearly affects them. Most people in that room will notice the contradiction and let it pass. The pattern seeker can't. They'll bring it up later, sometimes to the manager's face, not to cause trouble, but because the unresolved gap between what was said and what was done feels like an actual wound that needs closing. This is the same mechanism that makes great scientists, great editors, great fraud investigators. It's also the same mechanism that makes family dinners exhausting for everyone else at the table. But noticing contradictions is only the entry point. Once that alarm goes off, the mind has to decide what to do with the discomfort, and that's where the next pattern takes over. The second pattern is the mind built for self-protection through control. This one usually traces back to a specific kind of history, growing up around unpredictability. A parent whose mood shifted without warning, a household where the rules changed depending on who was watching, a relationship where promises and actions lived in 2 different universes.
When a child grows up in that kind of environment, their nervous system learns an early lesson. that information cannot be trusted just because someone said it out loud, and that the only real safety comes from verifying things yourself every single time. This is why some people interrogate even kind gestures. A partner brings them flowers for no reason, and instead of relaxing into it, part of their mind is quietly asking, what does this mean? What's coming next? What am I being softened up for? It's exhausting for the person doing it, and it can feel deeply alienating for the person on the receiving end who only wanted to do something nice. But this isn't suspicion for its own sake. It's a nervous system that learned in childhood that the cost of being wrong about someone's intentions was too high to risk again. Researchers studying attachment and early relational trauma describe this as hypervigilance, and it's not a personality quirk. It's a survival adaptation that simply never got the memo that the danger has passed. There's a quieter cousin to this pattern, though, one that doesn't come from trauma at all, and it's worth pulling apart from the first because people often confuse the two. The third pattern is intellectual autonomy, and this is closer to what most people picture when they imagine an independent thinker. This isn't fear-driven, it's identity-driven. Some people simply accepting an idea secondhand as a kind of small loss, a tiny surrender of their own authority over their own mind. Developmental psychologists who study moral and intellectual reasoning describe this as a marker of what's called post-conventional thinking, the stage where a person stops asking, "What does the rule say?" and starts asking, "Does this rule actually hold up?" You'll see this person ask, "But why does it have to be done that way?" about a process that's worked fine for 10 years, not because they think it's broken, but because they haven't personally tested whether it's actually the best way, or just the way everyone agreed to stop questioning. They're not trying to be difficult, they genuinely cannot rest on inherited certainty. If they haven't walked through the logic themselves, the conclusion doesn't feel earned, no matter how many credentialed people are standing behind it. There's a version of this person who takes it one layer further. They'll read the original research paper instead of trusting the headline that summarized it. They'll rebuild a spreadsheet from scratch instead of taking someone else's formula on faith, just to see, with their own eyes, that the numbers actually behave the way they're supposed to. Friends sometimes find this baffling, even a little insulting, as if the autonomous mind doesn't trust them specifically. But it's rarely personal. The autonomous mind treats every claim the same way, regardless of who's making it, family, expert, or stranger. Authority alone has never been enough for this person. It never will be. What they're chasing isn't doubt for its own sake. It's the specific, almost physical relief of having walked the reasoning themselves and arrived at the same place independently. That drive to test things personally, though, can tip into something heavier when the stakes feel high enough, and that's where things start to get more painful. The fourth pattern is anxiety wearing the mask of diligence. This is one of the harder ones to spot because from the outside it looks identical to thoroughness. Someone asks for the source, asks for the data, asks what happens if this goes wrong, asks again in a different way 2 days later. It looks like rigor, but underneath, the questioning isn't actually searching for an answer. It's trying to manufacture a feeling of certainty that the situation doesn't actually allow for. This shows up most clearly around decisions with real consequences, a medical diagnosis, a job offer, a relationship milestone. The person asks every possible question, gets thoughtful, complete answers, and still doesn't feel settled. So they ask again, slightly reframed, hoping this time the answer will land differently in their bide. It rarely does, because the questions were never really about gathering missing facts. They were about trying to outrun an uncomfortable feeling by converting it into a problem that logic could supposedly solve. Anxiety researchers call this reassurance seeking, and the cruel irony is that the more reassurance someone receives this way, the more their mind treats reassurance as the thing it needs, rather than tolerance for uncertainty itself, which is the thing it actually needs to build. Not every relentless questioner is anxious, though. Some of them are doing almost the opposite, and it can look surprisingly similar from across the room. The fifth pattern is the contrarian instinct, and this one is wired closer to identity and ego than to fear or curiosity. For some people, disagreement itself feels good. There's a small charge that comes from being the person who didn't just go along with the group, the one who poked a hole in the popular opinion while everyone else was nodding. Social psychologists who study group dynamics note that a portion of people who constantly challenge consensus aren't doing it because they found a flaw. They're doing it because standing apart from the group is itself the reward. You'll recognize this in the person who pushes back on whatever the room has just agreed to, almost reflexively, sometimes even when they don't fully believe their own counterargument. It's less, "I see something everyone else missed," and more, "the position of disagreement is where I feel most like myself." Often, this traces back to childhood roles, the kid who got attention only by being the difficult one, the disruptor, the one whose opinion finally made the table go quiet. Agreement in that early environment meant disappearing into the background.
Disagreement meant being seen. Decades later, the body still chases that same flicker of visibility, even in rooms where nobody is fighting for attention at all. This pattern can fuel real innovation. Plenty of breakthroughs come from someone who simply refused to accept the obvious answer. But it can also burn out relationships fast, because people eventually stop trusting a disagreement that shows up no matter what the topic is, and they start bracing for it before the contrarian has even opened their mouth. There's a sixth pattern, and it sits underneath several of the others, quieter than contrarianism, less visible than anxiety, but in some ways the most fundamental of them all. The sixth pattern is the wound of betrayed trust. This is the person who was lied to in a way that mattered by a parent, a partner, an institution they believed in, and who learned in that single moment that calm confidence and honesty are not the same thing. Once that lesson lands, smoothness itself becomes suspicious. The more reassuring someone sounds, the more this person's mind quietly leans forward and starts checking. Trauma researchers describe this as a rupture in what's called basic trust, the default setting most people carry that allows them to believe new information without demanding proof first. Once that default setting breaks, it doesn't usually come back on its own. It has to be rebuilt, slowly, case by case, and some people spend years doing that rebuilding without ever quite getting back to where they started. This is the person who reads a contract twice, even when the other party seems completely trustworthy, who asks a doctor to explain the reasoning behind a diagnosis, not because they doubt medicine, but because they once trusted someone's confident tone and it cost them. They might replay a friend's casual comment for days, searching it for the same smoothness that once preceded a betrayal, even when nothing about this friend has ever pointed toward dishonesty. From the outside, it can look like distrust of the current person standing in front of them. From the inside, it's almost never about that person specifically. It's a much older voice, still running the same protective program it learned to run the first time trust collapsed, doing its job a little too well, a little too often, on people who never actually earned the suspicion. And that brings us to the pattern that ties every single one of these together, the one most people questioning everything never see clearly about themselves, because you can't easily see the water you're swimming in. The seventh pattern is the loss of effortless rest. Every version we've walked through so far, the pattern seeker, the hypervigilant nervous system, the autonomous thinker, the anxious diligence, the contrarian instinct, the betrayed trust, they all share one quiet cost that rarely gets named out loud. The mind that questions everything is a mind that almost never gets to switch off. Other people get to receive a piece of information and simply hold it. The constant questioner has to process it, test it, turn it over, before they're even allowed to set it down. That's not a small difference. Over months and years, it adds up to a kind of fatigue that looks like exhaustion, but is actually closer to never having been granted permission to stop working. This is why some of the sharpest, most perceptive people you'll ever meet also describe a strange kind of loneliness, not because no one understands their ideas, but because almost no one else seems to need to verify the world the way they do, which can make connection itself feel like one more thing to be carefully checked rather than simply enjoyed. Now that you've seen all 7 of these laid out side by side, here's where it gets personal. Think back to the last time you or someone close to you pushed back hard on something that everyone else had already accepted. Which of these 7 patterns was actually running underneath it? Was it genuine curiosity about a real inconsistency? Was it an old nervous system still checking for danger that isn't there anymore? Was it a need to feel like the smartest person in the room? Or was it the quiet ache of someone who got burned once and never fully recovered the ability to simply trust? None of these answers make a person broken. They make a person explainable. And there's a real difference between feeling like you're just like that and actually understanding the specific moment your mind decided this was the safest way to move through the world. If any part of this hit close to home, send it to the person in your life who questions everything, or the person who's been on the other end of your questions and never quite understood why. This is exactly the kind of thing that deserves to be talked about out loud instead of just lived with silently. If this gave you language for something you felt for years but could never quite explain, there's a closely related question worth sitting with next. The difference between someone who questions everything because they're protecting themselves and someone who's simply forgotten how to trust their own judgment without external proof. That distinction changes everything about how you'd approach healing it, and it's exactly what the next video in this series breaks down, so keep an eye out for it on your screen and in the description below. Before you go, thank you for staying through this whole video. If even one of these 7 patterns made you think, "Oh, that's me," or "Oh, that's exactly them," that's genuinely the entire reason this video exists. If it gave you a little more clarity about yourself or someone you care about, tapping like helps this reach someone else who needs it too. I'd love to know in the comments which of these 7 patterns felt the most like looking in a mirror: the pattern seeker, the hypervigilant one, the autonomous thinker, the anxious diligence, the contrarian, the betrayed trust, or the exhaustion underneath all of it. And if you want more of this kind of honest, grounded look at why your mind works the way it does, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Take care of yourself and take care of the people who question things, because most of the time they're not trying to make your life harder. They're just trying to feel safe in a world that already taught them not to.